Let me thank, first of all, AOD for their kind invitation to talk for 45 minutes about the way of gardens, and in particular, the way in which what is commonly known as jardin à la française, French gardens, and jardin à l'anglaise, English gardens, produce different meanings in completely different ways. Sir William Chambers published in 1772 a text called A Dissertation on Oriental Gardening, in which he says, gardeners are not only botanists, but also painters and philosophers. And this is, of course, what we are after through the painting, the philosophy of those two kinds of gardens. And if you look, of course, at a map of Versailles, what strikes you immediately is at the bottom of the map here, the converging roads towards the Place d'Armes, that is to say, the huge square outside the castle, on the eastern side of the castle, and then in a way branching off from the castle, used as center, the different itineraries through the garden. So we have this converging movement of everything that is outside the garden towards the castle, and within the garden, the diverging movements from the castle itself. Whereas if we look for a minute at the map of one of the most fabulous 18th century landscape gardens, namely Stourhead, of course, we immediately realize that there is neither converging nor diverging from or towards a central point. And this, again, confirms this idea that Versailles is centered on the castle. What is a garden? A garden is a microcosmic picturing of a real or imaginary order of the world. The world is ordered in the garden and by the garden. And therefore, creating a garden means assuming the power of producing an image or images of the world. The garden is an image which enables us to decipher the world. If we go for a minute to Vaux-le-Vicomte, one of the masterpieces of Le Nôtre preceding Versailles, we can see, of course, that this structure of the convergence towards the castle and the divergence from the castle is clearly expressed here. We see its confirmation in Versailles, and it should, of course, remind us of the Vitruvian Man that Leonardo drew probably around 1490. And if we play for a minute with images, we can see that in Leonardo's Man, everything seems to converge towards the head and then diverge from the head, whether you look at it from the arms point of view or from the feet point of view. And we have exactly the same thing which means probably that in the French garden, the castle or the place where human presence is preserved embodies the role of man in the universe. The universe converges towards man and diverges from man. René Descartes, of course, was convinced that there was one absolutely essential faculty in man, and that was reason. And if we look at this view of the gardens of Versailles, where the king, Louis XIV, is having a walk, and you know that, of course, Louis XIV was so concerned with the exact interpretation of Versailles that he produced a guidebook to how to wander around the gardens of Versailles. And you can see, of course, that the garden is submitted in the French garden. The garden is submitted to a totally rational organization of, geometrical organization of. Everything is based on symmetry and on pure shapes. Nature, the trees are not allowed to grow the way they would like to. They are supposed to embody and represent perfect shapes, right? And the flower beds, right? The parterre, as they are called, are, of course, are not allowed to grow the way they want. They are designed, of course, to evoke, again, perfect shapes. And for those of you who did not know that detail, in fact, flowers were banned from French gardens because flowers embodied, in a way, the passing of time. And the garden must remain, of course, immune from the destructive power of time. And so the flowers were replaced by piled bricks which were then painted different colors in order to evoke the different possibilities of coloring the garden. And so the whole organization of the garden in terms of alleyways, flower beds, hedges, etc., implies that in man, the supreme faculty is the organizing faculty based, of course, on the power of reason. When Bernini came to France to build a portion of the Louvre, which he was never allowed finally to build, he was asked, as a kind of a token of gratitude for coming to France, to produce a statue of Louis XIV. And Colbert, in particular, was absolutely appalled by this idea that the king could be represented as if for a minute the king had been destabilized by the movements of his horse. And when you look at at Versailles, the way in which the basins are used as mirrors, as if the whole function of water and the whole function of nature was only to act as a mirror of the king's presence and of the king's power. This, of course, is a statue of Louis XIV that Colbert much preferred to the Bernini statue, because, of course, here Louis XIV is perfectly in command of his horse and of the situation around the horse. And when you look at Versailles, what always strikes me is we have the main facade overlooking the two basins, and we saw one of the two basins a minute ago with the main facade reflected in the basin. If you look at the basin, which is at the bottom left of the picture here, you will see that it is totally out the main axis of the castle. It's on the right-hand side of the main facade and much lower in terms of, look at this, for instance, right? And still, if you look carefully, you will see that on the left-hand side of the dragon, you can see a reflection of the facade of the garden. Nothing can escape its duty of reflecting the king's presence and the king's power, which, by the way, implied in Le Nôtre a mastery of optics, which is absolutely fabulous, right? Le Nôtre could never have organized the garden so as to guarantee a reflection of the facade in a basin which was so totally outside the main the main orientations of the garden, if Le Nôtre had not been a perfect master of optics. And this is the wall surrounding Versailles. And this wall, of course, evokes irresistibly the wall of fortresses that Louis XIV asked, of course, Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban to produce around the kingdom itself. So in a way, Versailles was a model of the kingdom, surrounded by this fortified wall, which prevented enemies from entering the castle, and the fortresses of Le Vauban prevented enemies from entering the kingdom. And so the central presence of the castle, the focalizing presence of the castle in the French garden, implies that it represents man in the universe, reason in man, and the king in his kingdom. And what is absolutely marvelous is that in a portion of the whole Versailles complex, there is one portion of that whole Versailles complex which juxtaposes rather amazingly a French garden on the left-hand side and an English garden. Because, of course, this corresponds roughly to the 1750s, 1760s, when hegemony was being transferred from France to England, largely on economic grounds and on a new version of the functioning of the monarchy. And the absence of an absolute monarchy in England probably made it possible for England to be the place where the Industrial Revolution, this new form of hegemony based on economics rather than based on the economic life of the nation, rather than its sort of a purely military power or official political structure around the absolute monarchy. This is, of course, the famous portrait of Louis XIV by Hyacinthe Rigaud, which echoes the vision of which was implemented and presented by Le Nôtre. And here you have a Quaker meeting house in Oxford, where you see that, of course, what is underlined here is the importance of the being together, of the assembly, right? There is a center, but this center is, in a way, produced by the fact that this is what we would call perhaps a church. A meeting house in the Quaker community is the equivalent of a church. The table in the center, very simple and ordinary table, is the altar, right? And the seats around imply that the sacredness of the place does not derive from the dominant position of the king, but the sacredness of the place emerges from the being together under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So the French garden is characterized by its monopolarity, its pendular movements, the importance of the center and hierarchy, and the mechanistic organization of. Whereas the English garden is characterized by a multipolarity, as we saw a minute ago on Petit Trianon, Brownian movements, wandering and combining, and something which is much more systemic. Now, this was guaranteed, of course, by an invention which people say was produced by the English garden. And it is, of course, the fact that the wall was replaced by a man called Charles Bridgeman, who is supposed to be the inventor of this new way of delineating the garden. And this is the ha-ha. Right. The ha-ha, as you can see, I'm going to show you an image which is extremely clear, right? Between the level of the garden and the level of nature, you dig a ditch which you consolidate by a wall, so that when you are in a garden surrounded by a typical wall, you cannot see the outside of the garden. Whereas when you are in a garden surrounded by an ha-ha wall, of course, you have the impression, the illusion that the garden flows freely into nature, or that nature flows freely into the garden. And in this picture, of course, you can see one of the fabrics of an English garden on the left-hand side. If you stood outside the main door, and if you were looking towards the ha-ha that you see here, of course, you really get the impression you cannot see the dividing line generated by the ha-ha, except if you are a specialist, right? When you are a ha-ha specialist, you immediately see where it is, but it's an acquired talent, shall we say. But you get the impression, and this is very, very important, and Petit Trianon is surrounded by a ha-ha, which people don't know very much about, but it does exist. And when I take people to Petit Trianon, I show them the ha-ha, which is, of course, the main difference between that. And, of course, this implies that the French garden is an anti-natural world. Nature is supposed to be perverse. Nature is under the authority of evil and sin, right? Natural. Whereas the English garden teaches you to look at nature. When you are in an English garden surrounded by a ha-ha, the garden, the organization of the garden is there to, in a way, lead you to learn how to look at nature. Here you have one of the most fantastic landscape in 18th century landscape gardens in England, which is called Stowe in Buckinghamshire. What is interesting about Stowe, and I've never been able to find a map of the original state of Stowe, originally Stowe was a French garden, and it was, shall we say, anglicized later on. And that happened to a few gardens in Europe, usually princely or royal gardens, which had been French because that was the fashion, and which suddenly, in order to remain fashionable, had to turn from a French model to an English model. And the English garden is based on the notion of vista. That is to say, you have a view of, at the end of the view, you have what is known as a night. By the way, there is a ha-ha between the two pavilions that you see here on the right and on the left and the main point of view. So you will not be going to this point of view, but on the way to this point of view, you will discover another point of view, which will then lead you to another section of the garden. This is very important. Normally, in a French garden, when you emerge in what I call the king's eyes position, that is to say, the central point on the top step of the staircase or the flight of steps that leads you into the garden. From the point of view of the king's eye, you have normally laid out before you the totality of the organization of the garden. And in fact, it means that you don't have to go into the garden. You know how it works. You know how it functions mechanistically, right? And then you can go back home, you can go back inside and, don't waste your time. Whereas in the English garden, by definition, you never see where you are going next. It's only once you have reached what we call the eye catcher, that reaching the eye catcher, you discover another vista with another eye catcher, right? Which will then lead you on. And you can see this, for instance, here, very important. It's a representation of an English garden by Edward Haightley, which is in Melbourne, now in Australia. And you can see, we're going to talk in a minute about fabrics, but the essential thing is you cannot see the castle, right? You don't know where the castle is. It doesn't appear. And it's people wandering around, and probably there is a possibility of keeping the cows away. I can see the ha-ha, but it's not easy to see, but it's keeping the cows away from the place where the people are walking. And this is, of course, typically John Locke. Knowledge derives from experience. In a French garden, you are on the top step, in the middle of the top step, and you gain an idea of how the garden functions, and that's it. You don't need anything else. In England, in the English garden, as you cannot see the totality of the garden from the castle, you're obliged to take the risk of discovering the garden, of experiencing the garden by walking. And this is fundamentally the difference between Descartes, right, this capacity to conceive without experiencing, and Locke, the inability to conceive without experiencing, right? Nihil est in intellectu quod not sit prius in sensu, says Locke. There is nothing in the intelligence which hasn't been first in the senses. It's through sensorial experience that you create and gain knowledge. And of course, this suggests that the English landscape garden has got to do with painting, whereas the French garden had got to do with architecture. The French garden is architecture, the English garden is painting. And Alexander Pope, a great early 18th century English poet, said, "In all, let nature never be forgot," right? It's nature that dictates the organization of the garden, so that by discovering the garden, you will be more aware and more precisely aware of what nature is. And this is very amazing. You can see halfway through the picture, so to speak, you can see the castle slightly on the right, but you see that the garden is not in the axis, in the main axis of the castle. And here you have, of course, the owner of the garden with two ladies, and the owner of the garden is looking at the garden and at the landscape through a field lens, right? Which suggests what? The importance of optics. You cannot understand if you do not see, if you cannot see. And this, of course, was the obsession of Isaac Newton also. Alexander Pope, the same poet I quoted earlier on, had this marvelous distich, right? Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Right. And that is the importance of Newton for the Anglo-Saxon world and for the rest of the world. He is absolutely essential. So optics probably has to do here with Newton. And on top of the fabric, we're going to come back to the fabric in a moment, you have this notion of the presence of Hermes or Mercury. Hermes or Mercury was the god of, he was a god of stealing, he was the god of thieves, but he was also the god of circulation and exchanges. And this led, you probably know, to the creation of this double mythological figure, Athena. Athena is the goddess of wisdom. Hermes is the god of exchanges. And so the idea that the only form of wisdom is in exchanges, sharing, etc. And this is, of course, very important in the English garden, because in the English garden, the lesson is accumulated progressively by your discovery of the various fabrics, right? And so when you see this map of Stowe with the different fabrics, to which we are going to come back in a minute, this is typical of what you discover in an English garden. You cannot see very much on the side, but you have the vista, right? The eye catcher, and you try to find a way to this eye catcher. And once you get to the eye catcher, you will suddenly be rewarded for your intelligence in finding the way there by the opening out of another vista with another eye catcher. And gradually, remembering the previous eye catchers which you have seen, you will, by connecting the eye catchers together and trying to find the emotional or logical link between the eye catchers, between the fabrics, you will gradually build up through your experience, through your sensorial experience, your intellectual intelligence of the functioning and the lesson of the English garden. The Medici Venus in this superb Tullus, Greek Tullus, which is magnificent. This came from a very, very important figure in the Italian Renaissance called Leo Battista Alberti, who in his De Re Aedificatoria, his book, his treatise on architecture, said, if you want to build a garden, don't leave it entirely to nature. Punctuate nature with the presence of culture. Small buildings, which he called fabricae, which in English we call fabrics, small buildings, which will have a meaning and which will give a meaning to the garden, particularly if you can create an intellectual link between the different fabrics. This was for the first time experienced probably in a very famous garden in north of Rome, which is called Bomarzo, which was conceived by a very important aristocratic presence in the Italy of the time, Vicino Orsini, and a brilliant intellectual, Piero Ligorio, whom you can see on the right-hand side. Piero Ligorio was the first man to rediscover Hadrian's villa in Tivoli. And in Bomarzo, you have these magnificent fabrics, right? Hercules and Cacus, which remind you of the fact that it's a combination of intelligence and strength which will make you a winner in the world, or the fact that we are sometimes confronted with terrifying spectacles, terrifying experience. But if you look carefully, you will see that inside the mouth, right, you have a table, right, and you can sit around the table, and you can only eliminate terrors by discussing them with friends or people who are like you, trying to understand what you are terrified by and why you are terrified. So this notion of collaboration in solving the mystery of terror. And then, of course, the famous Leaning House. This is post-Copernican revolution. And when you enter the house, I've taken, 25, 30 groups to this space. And when you enter the house, after 2 minutes, people move out because they feel sick. And what the object of the exercise was to show man that since the Copernican revolution, which had dislodged the earth from the center of the world. Man, when he looked at the world, felt sick because he no longer knew where he was and where he stood in relationship to the rest of the world. Man was no longer in the center, and if man was not central in space, maybe he was not central in time either, which Darwin, of course, later on confirmed. So in the English garden, there are three essential presences, as we've said. The first one was the abolition of the absolute monarchy in England. After 1688, the Glorious Revolution, when the last of the Stuarts was thrown out of England, he found refuge, it's no surprise, in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and the castle was given to him by Louis XIV because James II's model was Louis XIV. And in 1689, Parliament decided to offer the crown to the daughter of James II and his son-in-law, but before giving them the crown, they made them sign the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is, in a way, the first essential manifestation of a constitutional monarchy, not an absolute monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy. The Bill of Rights was a contract between the monarch and the nation. Right? Then, of course, Newton and Locke, as we said. There are four essential English gardens in the south of England, so fairly rapidly accessible from London. Chiswick, the first, Rousham, Stowe, Stourhead. They can all be visited. Two belong to the National Trust, Stowe and Stourhead. Chiswick is English heritage, and Rousham is still a private property. And this, once again, is the typical architecture. And as you are wandering down the main central lawn from the front, from the facade of Stowe House, on the left-hand side, you suddenly see this arch. And when you reach the arch, you discover the vista and the eye-catcher of the Palladian Bridge. And that functions like a moon gate in a Chinese garden, right? And this is a Palladian Bridge. Everybody who wandered around Stowe and who was a guest of the owner knew that this could only be a Palladian Bridge. Andrea Palladio was the most brilliant architect of 16th century Italy. When Venice was obliged to turn west, turn to agriculture, turn to land, as opposed to east, commerce and the sea, because of the closing down of the Silk Road, because Constantinople had been taken by the Ottomans, Palladio replaced the enormous palaces of the Grand Canal in Venice by heads of agricultural exploitation known as the Palladian villas. Right? And Palladio became the model of 18th century architecture in England. And this was a bridge. The shape of this bridge, the way, the structure of this bridge is provided by the four books, the Quattro Libri d'Architettura of Palladio. And in this book, in the chapter devoted to bridge, you found this bridge and you reproduced it in your English estate just to show that you were aware of and you shared the same culture as the elites you belong to. And when you look at Prior Park, which is a superb English garden just outside Bath, at the bottom of the garden, you have the same Palladian bridge. This was a sign of recognition between people belonging to the same elite of responsibility. Initiative in England after 1688 no longer came from the king, it came from the aristocrats. And it was the circulation of initiative among aristocrats, who included among them later on the first heroes of the Industrial Revolution. The heroes of the Industrial Revolution were recognized because of their contribution to the wealth of the country as deserving a position in the aristocracy. It's a sign of recognition among the members of this elite. And here you have another Palladian bridge in another of the English gardens, perhaps the most beautiful still today, called Stourhead. Stourhead was not built by the king. Stourhead was not built by an aristocrat. It was built by a merchant banker, Henry Hore, number 2. His father was Henry Hore I. He was known as Il Magnifico because he spent a lot of time in Italy on the Grand Tour, All those things would not have existed without the institution of the Grand Tour. But we can't go into the Grand Tour now. It would be too long. And the Hoare Merchant Bank still exists today in the city of London, right? And you see, this is fantastic, because the way Hoare planted his trees, he did not know the trees would develop and assume that shape. But the way in which, of course, the tree frames the beauty of the Temple of Hercules in the background is just absolutely amazing. And this Temple of Hercules, of course, is borrowed from a painting by Claude Gelée, called Claude Lorraine, right? A painting of 1672, which Henry Hoare had bought in Rome during his Grand Tour, that he brought back to Stourhead, which inspired the architect of the temple devoted to Hercules, called Henry Flitcroft, to whom we will come back in a minute. And this painting is now in the National Gallery in London, right? And this is, of course, I mean, it's superb. It's so totally different from the French garden. This succession of vistas, right, which define an itinerary, and you go from vista to vista, because when you reach the eye catcher, the fabric, then you discover another vista, and then you go on walking. Inside, within the temple to Hercules that you see here, there is this statue of Hercules by John Michael Rysbrack, the fashionable sculptor of the time. And look, in Stourhead, the house still today, you have another painting which was bought by Henry Hoare when he was in Rome, a painting representing Hercules having to choose between virtue on his right-hand side and pleasure on his left-hand side. On the left-hand side, you can see probably Cupid holding flowers, and on the right-hand side, dressed in pure white, virtue, asking you to climb towards, of course, heroism and all that. And when you are in the Temple of Hercules in Stourhead, with your back to the entrance to the temple, on the right-hand side, you can see this marvelous temple to Apollo, right, by Henry Flitcroft, the architect that Henry Hoare chose to build the fabrics. Temple of Apollo, the arts, artistic life. And on the left-hand side, and you notice probably the bridge. The bridge links together Apollo, the temple to Apollo on the right-hand side, and the temple to Flora on the left-hand side. And so you have this idea of, in the garden, the conjunction of culture and nature. If you are only on the side of nature, you are not really human. If you are only on the side of culture, you're not really human either. It is the combination of, the reconciliation of, which is so important, combination of nature and culture, organized by Henry Hoare, an experience of darkness. This is a kind of temple built underground, right? You have to walk down along a slope, and suddenly you enter a world which is entirely cold and dark. And Hoare says to you, there will be moments in your life when you will have the impression of walking through cold and darkness. But, and here, of course, you find a statue of Ariadne. Ariadne, you remember, was abandoned by Theseus in favor of her sister, and she was left on her own, abandoned in cold and darkness. And you have also the representation of a river god borrowed from a very important Italian painter of the 17th century called Salvatore Rosa. So you have a celebration of nature through culture. But in this dark and cold place, you just have a hole in the wall, which has been organized, of course, so that you can see the temple of Apollo, which is also the temple of the sun. And when you are in the roughest form of nature, the stones are rough, there is no harmony, no order, you are reminded of the fact that you are going through a phase of difficulty, cold, darkness. But if you go on walking, if you've got the energy and the determination to go on walking, you will rejoin, of course, the world of light and the world of hope, never losing hope. Finally, the obelisk which represents the position, the place of man in nature, man learning from nature, but organizing nature around him. And then, of course, the famous church. Because this, one of the first vistas in the garden is a vista of the local parish church. People were worried, well, not worried, but wondered why Henry Hoare had not planted a sort of a group of trees that would have hidden the church. But this comes directly from the Japanese garden. The Japanese garden where, for instance, at the bottom of the hill, you have a garden, and the castle that you have at the top of the hill existed before the garden. And the people who created the garden made sure that from the newly created garden, you could see the already existing castle. And this is known as shakei in Japanese, and it means borrowed landscape. The garden borrows an element of the garden, of nature, to introduce it, of the landscape, to introduce it into the garden. And so the church is pure borrowed landscape. It was there before the garden, but Hoare borrowed it from the landscape to introduce it into the garden. And the most moving detail, of course, is that his wife is buried in the church, and he only began the garden after the death of his wife. And the garden is a lesson in how to survive in a world from which the person who made for you the meaning of that world has disappeared. Hoare's wife, once dead, Hoare was obsessed by the idea of trying to come to terms with how can you live in a world, the person from which the person who made for you the meaning of that world has disappeared. And as a result, of course, he created the garden, which you have to do anti-clockwise. Because if you do it clockwise, you submit to time and to death. If you do it anti-clockwise, anti-clockwise, then, of course, you react against time and death, right? And if we go back to Stowe, one Stowe was produced by different architects at different moments of the history of the family. Kent, who had this, Kent is regarded as the first, Chiswick, which I mentioned earlier on, is the first English landscape garden and was entirely created by Kent. And Kent said all gardening is landscape painting, and Horace Walpole, one of the great letter writer of the 18th century, had this marvelous formula when he tried to analyze the English landscape garden. Kent leaped the fence and saw that all nature was a garden. And you have in Stowe one of the most brilliant moments of intelligence of Kent. You use this talus, this rotunda, into which you can get through two doors, and the doors are not opposite each other. They communicate at angles, which means that between the two doors you have a long portion of the wall and a very short portion of the wall. On the long portion of the wall, you have three statues. On the small portion of the wall, you have one statue. The three statues on the long portion of the wall are Epaminondas on the left, who represents strength. Lycurgus in the center, who represents law, and then Socrates on the right-hand side, who represent wisdom. And the three of them are looking at the only statue on the other side, Homer, the blind poet, characterized by vision. You may have strength, you may have law, you may have wisdom and philosophy. If you have no vision, you are no leader, you see? So the whole garden was devised as a constant reminder, as a mirror for princes, these constant reminders of which virtues and which work you should do on yourself to remain legitimate, right? And on the other side of the small river, you have lower, of course, right, the British worthies. We have just seen the Temple of Ancient Virtue. You have the British worthies. And these British worthies will isolate, of course, 5 busts, right, a series of busts. The central bust, of course, is William III, the king who accepted the Bill of Rights and the king who accepted that monarchy in England would never again be absolute, but that it would be constitutional. On the right-hand side at the bottom, John Hemdham, the leader of the parliamentary majority that opposed the absolute monarchy as seen by the Stuarts. On the right-hand side at the top, Francis Drake, the first British circumnavigator of the world. On the left-hand side at the left, Isaac Newton. And of course, on the left-hand side at the top, the man who founded the Stock Exchange of London, right? So the idea that all political power, discoveries, political opposition, science, all those things have to be financed. And they have to be financed by the free play of wealth, money, creation, production, etc. And then, of course, you had a monument of this book, the discoverer of the fifth continent, a Chinese tea house, as if already in the 18th century, everybody knew that whichever country masters trade with China is automatically the world leader, right? So, you know, the more it changes, the more it is the same in a way. And you have that in, of course, Potsdam in Germany. Frederick II was obsessed by, at the same time, the English landscape garden and the importance of China. Then, of course, in the English garden, you always had Gothic elements, which reminded you of the fact that in 1215, the barons forced the king, John Lackland, to sign the Magna Carta. For the first time in the history of England in 1215, the absolute monarchy was, in a way, challenged, right? But here, of course, also in his tower had King Alfred's tower. Alfred, of course, raised the standard of resistance to Saxon invasions because he was a Celt. And then, of course, in the garden, you can have this evocation of courtly romanticism. That is to say, the idea that in the 18th century, court life was seen as the epitome of artificiality, and real emotions could only be found by direct contact with nature. And so life in the countryside became the only way of reaching genuine human feelings. And this explains why the tomb of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the gardens of Ermenonville became a tourist attraction. And this, which is in the Hameau in Versailles, which is known as ornamented farm, what we saw a minute ago was also an ornamented farm, right, is characteristic of English gardens. And in the Gartenreich in Dessau, in Saxony, which is one of the most fabulous English gardens in the world, you have the evocation of the tomb of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Ermenonville within the Gartenreich, the Empire of Gardens. Kent reappears in a garden which is known as Rousham. What is so moving about Rousham is that it is still today in the ownership of the original creators, right? The Cotterell Dormer family still owns Rousham with its circulations and connections. The only fabric that you see when you arrive at Rousham is this, right? At the bottom, at the very end of the garden on the hill, you barely see it behind. There is a sham. The sham was a false creation, which gave you the impression that the garden was very long and had a remarkable extension, but it was all sham, all pretense, right? Now, lion and horse, like Giambologna at the end of the 16th century, like George Stubbs, the English painter, 1769, the confrontation between energy and the beauty of shape. If you only have the beauty of shape, it's dead and immobile. If you only have energy, it cannot be shared by shape and readability. So the tension between shape and energy is absolutely essential in life. And this is represented, of course, by the horse and the lion. And then, of course, you wonder, the horse and the lion. Once you have been to the horse and the lion, you will discover two itineraries, one on the left here, one on the right. In fact, on the right of the lion is the small itinerary. On the left of the lion, when you are exploring the garden, is the longer itinerary. The small itinerary is very interesting. Two fabrics only. One which is called the Hermitage, and you are invited to enter the house and sit down and contemplate nature. And you are told by Kent, if you are a wise man, there's no need for you to wander around. Just learning to sit down and to contemplate nature and be amazed by the fact that there is something rather than nothing, and that something is beautiful should be enough for humanity, so to speak, right? And if you follow a little bit further down, you will reach this seat, and by the seat, which enables you to be stable, you have the river flowing by. And the whole of human life is built on this notion of permanence and mobility. We aim at being permanent, and we are constantly attracted and surrounded by mobility. If you take the long itinerary, you will get, of course, to the Praeneste Terrace, which is because all these people had been to Italy, once again, the Grand Tour, and they had brought back ideas. And here, of course, you have the Temple of Fortuna Primigenia by Pietro da Cortona, which was reproduced on a small scale in Rome. And then you have the statue of the dying Gaul, right? Consenting to death. Nature will go on after you. Nature is circular. The life of man, the time of man is linear. It starts and it ends. Nature is constantly reborn from itself. And as you see the dying Gaul, behind him, you can see a shepherd with a sheep on his shoulders, looking at nature, which is ever reborn of its own death, right? And of course, then you come to the Veil of Venus. And as you go up the Veil of Venus towards the statue of Venus, you will find on the right-hand side this small brook. You will follow the brook, and you will come, of course, to this small pond. And here, in a very one of the simplest fabrics in all English garden, you have one of the most fabulous lessons of all English garden. You have time constantly running, and then instants, which we would like to remain. Don't forget that the pact between Faust and Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust is the day on which you say to the instant, remain forever, this day I will come and ask you for your soul. The day on which you say to the instant, verweile du bist so schön, remain, you are so beautiful, I will come and ask you for your soul. And this is absolutely remarkable. Here you have a way of organizing the world, and it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, in particular at Vaux-le-Vicomte, when the organization is based on illusion, but I don't have time to go into this now. And it's probably a theater, right? In the English garden, you have a succession of episodes. And here you have an episode which is itself a succession of episodes. Water running, water stable, water running. We move from the running of time to the stability of things to the running of time, right? And it's a succession of episodes like in a novel, right? And if the French garden is based on hierarchical authority, the English garden is based on the community. If the French garden depends on the presence of the king, the English garden depends on the assembly of fabrics, creating a collective meaning, which it is up to the person walking around the garden to try and assemble and understand. If the French garden is based on a dogma, the English garden is based on experience. And if the French garden is based on a royal initiative, the English garden is based on an individual initiative, an individual who tries to gather around him a community to create, of course, that experience. And we will stop here.